Okay, let's unpack this. What is really going on behind the scenes in Iran?
Hmm.
I mean, you're looking at a nation with this incredibly rich history, sitting right there at a strategic global crossroads.
Absolutely.
And lately, well, it feels like Iran is constantly in the headlines, doesn't it? Because of its growing geopolitical ambitions.
Yeah, every move seems to spark these huge global debates. What are they trying to achieve? What's the impact?
Exactly, from their nuclear program to, their involvement in conflicts across the region. Iran's actions really raise these fundamental questions about power, security, influence.
And our mission here in this deep dive is really to take the sources you've provided and pull out the most important insights, help understand these complexities.
Right.
Think of it as maybe a shortcut, a way to get genuinely well-informed on a topic that is anything but simple.
Exactly. We want to try and peel back the layers, move beyond the often polarized narratives you hear,
Yeah, the black and white thinking.
and find a more nuanced picture. So today, we're going to explore the nuclear program, the regional stuff, the crucial historical context,
This is so important.
their strategic goals, recent flashpoints like the uranium enrichment increase, diplomatic efforts, and, well, what it all means for you and the global stage.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's start with what feels like the absolute core issue driving so much international concern, Iran's nuclear program. How does that connect with their reach across the region?
Well, the nuclear program has been a major international focus for years, precisely because it ignites these fears of, a potential arms race in the Middle East.
The chain reaction,
Yeah,
potentially.
exactly. And Iran has openly pursued uranium enrichment since, the early 2000s? So it's been going on a while.
And here's where the sources flag a really critical development. Reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, they pointed out in 2023 that Iran had enough 90% enriched uranium.
And that 90% is the key threshold.
Right.
That's weapons grade.
Exactly. Enough to potentially produce multiple nuclear bombs if, and it's a big if, they made that decision to weaponize. That detail changes the stakes quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. It really does. And it brings up that fundamental question. Why? What's their motivation?
Right.
Iran consistently says it's about deterrence, a defense against regional rivals like Israel and Saudi Arabia.
And they probably point out, fairly, that both those nations are suspected of having or pursuing their own nuclear capabilities.
They do note that, yes. But critics push back hard. They see it not as defense, but purely as a power play, a move to assert dominance.
And that concern gets fueled by specifics, like a 2024 report mentioned in the sources noting Iran's refusal to fully cooperate with IAEA inspections.
Yeah, that lack of transparency, it doesn't exactly ease international worries, does it?
Not at all.
No. And what's really critical to grasp here is that this nuclear program isn't happening in some kind of vacuum. It's deeply tied in with Iran's regional interventions. Their actions across the Middle East tend to amplify the tensions coming from the nuclear file.
Okay, so let's connect those dots. We see this playing out clearly in places like Syria, right? Iran's been a crucial backer of President Bashar al-Assad since 2011.
A huge backer. They've deployed elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and supported proxies like Hezbollah to prop up his regime.
And the scale is significant. According to some reports, by 2023, you were looking at, an estimated 70,000 troops involved in that effort?
That's the figure cited, yeah. It's substantial. And then you look at Lebanon. Iran's backing of Hezbollah there is also massive.
How much are we talking?
Estimates put it around $700 million annually.
Mm.
And this isn't just, pocket money. It maintains this really formidable militia right on Israel's border, a direct challenge to Israeli security.
And then down in Yemen, the sources, including a 2022 UN report, document Iran arming the Houthi movement.
Right, supplying them with drones and missiles, the kind used to target Saudi Arabia.
So yeah, from one angle, these moves look purely destabilizing, directly countering Western-aligned states.
They certainly do. But the sources also kind of nudge us toward a more nuanced view. They suggest these actions reflect a calculated strategy by Iran. It seems to be about securing influence, establishing leverage in a region where they feel maybe surrounded by threats. There appears to be a method, a logic, driving these interventions, even if the results are disruptive.
And that calculated strategy, that logic, it makes a lot more sense when you dig into Iran's history, because their modern ambitions are just so profoundly shaped by the past.
Absolutely fundamental. The 1979 Islamic Revolution. I mean, that was a seismic event. It wasn't just swapping leaders. It fundamentally overthrew the U.S.-backed Shah
Right.
and established this unique Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. This completely reshaped Iran's foreign policy. It became about exporting revolutionary ideals, actively opposing what they saw as Western dominance.
And that core ideology, it hasn't vanished. It persists today, driven by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who's been there since '89, and that powerful group you mentioned earlier, the IRGC.
The RGC is, well, it's way more than just a military branch. It's this sprawling economic and political force. Sources suggest it held huge assets, maybe $95 billion by 2023.
Wow.
And its Quds force, now led by Esmail Kalani, they're central to everything we're talking about regionally. They oversee those proxy networks. They're key architects of Iran's strategy abroad.
But even going further back, before '79, you have to consider Iran's sense of identity. This view of itself as heir to a Persian empire stretching back to 550 BCE.
That deep history. It fosters this powerful sense of maybe cultural superiority.
Yeah.
And it definitely fuels a fierce resistance to foreign influence that you see threaded through their actions today.
And this brings up a really critical point about historical trust. Or, well, the lack of it.
Exactly. The 1953 CIA-backed coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, the one that put the Shah back in power, that left a really deep scar, a legacy of profound distrust towards the West, especially the U.S.
And decades of crippling sanctions since then have only reinforced that feeling, right? That feeling of being targeted, isolated.
Absolutely. It feeds into that narrative.
So when you piece it all together, the revolution, the IRGC's power, the ancient identity, the historical grievances, you start to see how it fuels this drive to assert sovereignty, to actively challenge powers like the United States.
And speaking of the U.S., that 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, that had a huge economic impact.
Massive. It brought back severe sanctions, costing Iran, what was the estimate? $200 billion in lost revenue by 2024.
According to some analyses, yes.
Yeah.
That's a huge hit that absolutely shapes their current thinking and calculations.
So if we connect this history and the internal power dynamics to their actions today, it seems like Iran's strategic goals are pretty complex, multifaceted.
Incredibly so. It's
That's fair.
definitely not a simple checklist. They seem to be juggling both what they perceive as defensive needs and offensive goals to project power.
One major aim analysts often point to is consolidating influence across the Middle East. There's this concept you hear about, creating a Shia crescent.
Right, that idea of a band of influence, potentially stretching from Tehran through Iraq, Syria, all the way to Lebanon on the Mediterranean.
And the strategic purpose there isn't just religious, is it?
No, not primarily. It seems more about creating a physical and political buffer zone. This zone would directly counter Western presence. Think about the big U.S. military bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and also challenge rivals like Saudi Arabia.
And you can see a strong defensive motivation, too, needing to secure their own borders against perceived threats.
Definitely. The 2020 U.S. assassination of General Qasem Soleimani.
A huge figure.
A key architect of their proxy network.
Yeah.
That seems to have really reinforced their perceived need for military strength. And we've seen their defense spending climb up 12% to $25 billion in 2023, according to CSI.
Protecting economic interests must be another key goal. They leverage their natural resources pretty effectively.
Oh, massively. They have the world's fourth largest oil reserves, around 157 billion barrels, and huge natural gas reserves, maybe 15% of the global total. These aren't just resources, they're bargaining chips, negotiation leverage.
And then there's the Strait of Hormuz, that vital waterway.
Absolutely critical. 20% of the world's oil passes through there. Iran views it as a potential choke point, and they haven't been shy about threatening to block it.
Those 2019 tanker seizures come to mind.
Exactly. A clear signal of their willingness to use that leverage.
So all these different objectives, they've really challenged that simplistic view of Iran as just, I don't know, a chaotic or purely ideological actor.
Right. It suggests a more calculated strategy. One designed to balance power in a really volatile neighborhood, even if, as the sources point out, pursuing these goals inevitably heightens tensions with other global players.
And that brings us right up to the very latest chapter. A really significant recent event highlighted in the sources is Iran's decision, announced in December 2024, to increase uranium enrichment again.
Yes, that was big. IAEA reports confirmed Iran started enriching uranium up to 60% purity at its Fordo facility. And crucially, 60% is very close to the 90% needed for weapons.
Uncomfortably close.
Extremely. And by May 2025, they had built up a significant stockpile, 121.5 kilograms, or about 267 pounds, of this highly enriched uranium.
And this move happened naturally after the talks to revive that JCPOA nuclear deal basically collapsed.
Right. The timing wasn't coincidental. The international response was pretty swift. The US and EU imposed new sanctions in January 2025, specifically targeting people and companies linked to the IRGC.
Iran, meanwhile, keeps saying this enrichment is purely for civilian nuclear power.
That's their official line. But the proximity to weapons-grade material has, understandably, fueled serious fears of a potential nuclear showdown. Some reports, like from Reuters, indicate Israeli officials have even warned about preemptive strikes if Iran crosses certain thresholds.
It just highlights this ongoing shadow war that's been simmering for years.
Exactly. Think about the 2020 assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a key nuclear scientist.
Right, and the cyber attacks.
Numerous cyber attacks on facilities like Natanz. But despite these major setbacks and attacks, Iran seems absolutely determined to press forward with its nuclear activities.
This development really tests global resolve, doesn't it?
Significantly. And sources point out how it's complicated by players like Russia and China. They often provide diplomatic cover or economic lifelines to Tehran.
Which undermines Western pressure.
It challenges Western efforts, yeah. So the events of late 2024, early 2025, they really pour cold water on any optimism that sanctions alone could stop Iran's nuclear ambitions. It forces a deeper look at their strategic calculations.
Speaking of strategy, let's look at the diplomatic side. The tightrope Iran seems to be walking. There's been a focus on diplomacy recently, particularly trying to revive the JCPOA.
That 2015 deal, yeah. Linking nuclear limits to sanctions relief. Talks did resume in Vienna back in 2021 with the EU trying to mediate.
But they essentially stalled out by 2023.
Pretty much. The fundamental sticking points just wouldn't budge. The U.S. wants broader restrictions on missiles, regional behavior, while Iran insists on lifting all the sanctions put back after the U.S. left the deal.
There was that specific example of the mutual distrust in 2024, right? Al Jazeera reported Iran proposed capping enrichment at 20% for partial sanctions relief.
And it was rejected by the other parties.
Yeah.
Yeah, a clear sign of how far apart they remain.
And this brings up Iran's internal politics, doesn't it? President Pezeshkian, elected in 2024, seems to signal support for engagement.
He does voice that, yes. But the hardliners within the IRGC and other powerful circles, they seem really resistant to making major concessions, especially under pressure. They don't want to look weak.
So the potential outcomes here look really uncertain. A revived deal may be unlikely now, but it could ease Iran's huge annual sanction burden. The IMF estimated that around $40 billion a year.
That's a massive incentive, economically.
Yeah.
But politically, very difficult to achieve right now.
And the flip side, failure of diplomacy carries the significant risks of escalation.
Absolutely. Israel's airstrikes on Iranian proxies in 2024, mentioned in the sources, are often read as signals of readiness for conflict if diplomacy fails completely.
It fuels that whole debate. Is Iran genuinely negotiating, or are they just using talks to buy time while the centrifuges keep spinning?
Well, analysis from places like the Carnegie Endowment suggests it might actually be a deliberate dual-track strategy.
Gaining.
Meaning pursuing diplomacy on one track, maybe hoping for some sanctions relief, while simultaneously building up their nuclear leverage and regional deterrence on the other track, hedging their bets.
That ambiguity seems key. It challenges any idea of a simple, straightforward solution here.
Exactly. It really underscores why understanding their complex motivations, not just counting their centrifuges, is so essential.
Okay, let's widen the lens now. Because Iran's ambitions, their actions, they don't just stay within the Middle East. They have really far-reaching implications for global security, for economics.
Oh, definitely. As a major regional player, Iran's influence is felt everywhere. Its actions directly impact global oil markets. Remember that 5% spike in Brent crude Bloomberg reported after the 2024 enrichment news.
Yeah, immediately.
And their role is just central to regional stability. Or instability, depending on how you look at it.
You saw that connection very clearly after the 2023 Israel-Hamas conflict started. Sources pointed to Iran-backed groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Escalating attacks from Lebanon and Syria, effectively widening the geographical scope of the Gaza war, pulling others in.
And major international bodies are definitely paying attention. NATO, for example, in its 2024 strategy paper, explicitly called Iran a strategic challenge.
Right, which contributes to things like the increased U.S. naval presence we see in the Persian Gulf. It's a direct response.
And Iran's rise is absolutely shaking up global alliances. The sources highlight these key relationships. Russia's $2 billion arms deal with Iran in 2023, reportedly including advanced Su-35 fighter jets.
That significantly boosts Tehran's military capabilities, yes. A big upgrade.
And then there's China, that massive $400 billion energy and investment pact signed back in 2021.
That provides crucial economic support, a lifeline against sanctions. Both of these relationships with Russia, with China, are often seen as part of a larger trend challenging U.S. dominance regionally and globally.
There's even this fascinating domestic economic angle. With sanctions biting hard and high inflation, some sources look at how ordinary Iranians, especially the unbanked, might be turning to crypto.
Right, and Tehran's own blockchain initiative in 2024. Some see it as an attempt to bypass sanctions, though other reports, like from the UN, flag the serious risks of money laundering when you sidestep traditional finance.
So if you pull all these threads together, it really suggests Iran's ambitions are actively reshaping power balances on a global scale.
It's a potent reminder that the international order isn't nearly as unipolar as maybe it once seemed. Understanding Iran's role in that shift is just crucial.
And all this complexity, all these layers, it really makes you step back and question that common portrayal of Iran as simply a rogue state acting irrationally.
Exactly. The sources we've gone through suggest that while many of its actions are deeply concerning, they can also be viewed, perhaps, as a calculated, even rational response to deeply felt historical grievances and very real perceived regional threats.
Take the nuclear program again. Yes, huge proliferation worries. But its dual-use nature, civilian energy versus potential weapons, you can also see it in parallel with Israel's undeclared arsenal.
Some analysts frame it less as just unilateral Iranian aggression and more as part of a dangerous, accelerating regional arms race dynamic. Everyone's watching everyone else.
And this brings us back to the sanctions paradox you touched on earlier.
Right. The clear intention is to pressure Iran, change its behavior. But the sources suggest an unintended consequence might be inadvertently bolstering the domestic power, economically and politically, of groups like the IRGC.
How so?
Well, when legitimate international trade is cut off, illicit networks often controlled by these powerful internal groups can flourish. Isolation might, paradoxically, strengthen the hand of the very hardliners you're trying to influence, making concessions less likely.
That level of complexity really challenges any simplistic view, any easy villainization.
It really does. It suggests that dealing effectively with Iran probably requires a much more nuanced approach, one that seriously considers the historical context, the internal power struggles, arguing for, maybe, dialogue alongside deterrence, rather than just relying solely on pressure.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's crystal clear that Iran's ambitions are anything but simple.
Far from it. They seem driven by this potent mix of revolutionary ideology, tracing back to '79, what they perceive as strategic necessity for survival in a tough neighborhood, and that deep, persistent historical distrust, especially towards the West.
And the implications are just huge. Their nuclear pursuits, their actions across the region, their complex diplomatic games, they're significantly reshaping dynamics, not just in the Middle East, but really in global politics.
And recent events, like that specific 2024 enrichment step-up and the stalled JCPOA talks, they really underscore the urgency of trying to genuinely understand what Iran is truly after.
Is it primarily about regional dominance? Is it fundamentally about national survival in a hostile environment? Or is it some constantly shifting combination of both?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. So after diving into all these sources with us, what do you think Iran is really after?